Hello again, comrade.
My tree's not fucking working. It's in debt.
Work, fucking tree.
It used to have more leaves on it. Now it's gotten rid of all of it.
Give me my fucking money, tree.
Are your trees working? They paying rent?
They're paying rent. You have a tree in your front yard, right?
It's
You should be collecting rent from it. You should go out there and yell at the tree, "Where's my fucking money?" Tree.
How dare you squat on my fucking yard and not pay for anything? And that, my friends, is the topic of conversation for today.
Trees. Yelling at trees. Get them to work. They're already working. Doing more good than any of us. So we read the new book, Can't Pay, Won't Pay from Debt Collective.
Yep.
Haymarket Books, who published it, had it as a free ebook for a couple of weeks before the release of the paperback. So we picked that up and read it. We were eager to read this. Can't Pay, Won't Pay, The Case for Economic Disobedience and Debt Abolition by the Debt Collective. Astra Taylor writes the foreword. The Debt Collective had what they call writer's block, pun intended, of Debt Collective founders Ann Larson, Astra Taylor, Hannah Appel, Thomas Goki, and Laura Hanna.
And on the tertiary outside is the scholar and writer Andrew Ross, who had a book they referenced called Cradocracy, and was a friend of Graeber and is still very much a friend of Astra Taylor. And he's kind of referenced in the book, but he was also part of the initial collective during Occupy Wall Street days.
First off, awesome book, important book.
It's necessary and it's vital.
Yep.
It's under 170 pages or about 170 pages. So it's one of the books that we think nonfiction should start to gravitate towards, which is don't overwrite, be to the point, be specific.
Short book, written by a group, right to the point, peeling away pretense. So,
doesn't condescend, but doesn't stultify with stupid common assertions. And it's like right in that middle where I think anyone could pick it up.
Yeah.
Because there's a point when it even describes what neoliberalism. So I think anyone literally could pick up the book and read it.
Yeah.
But if you're knowledgeable, it's also full of great insights too.
We would say everybody should read this book, and most everybody will have a reason to connect personally to the topic of the book, debt. It is
the chains that bind us.
Right. It's the bridge from the private sphere to public sphere. Certainly, this is something important to me individually because I have, for most of my adult life, had this thing knocking around my head that is like, Jesus Christ, these things are defining my life. And it's like, they all start with D. It's debt, depression, and disappointment, and despair. But debt is the thing that has been the defining feature of my life. Mm-hmm. And I feel alone in that. Most of the time I feel alone in that. But I know it's a shared experience.
And Noam Chomsky has said this, that it's actually by design, because when you take student loans, you don't start having to pay them until 6 months after graduation. And so you're automatized from other people when you should be enraged by the debt that you've generated from what should be a human right.
Yeah.
And I'm still paying, I'm 44 and I've had student debt since I was 18 and I'm still paying for student loans, right?
How much do you have?
Oh, not that much. But, once again, I got grants because of my father's unemployment and those sorts of things. So I have $3,000 left of student loans, but I'm 44.
You're almost there.
I'm almost there.
I'm 43 and I have $35,000 in debt still.
And that's after family help, right? I mean, you had some help.
I had a little bit of help a couple of years ago to try to pay down against it. Was $60,000. I had $15,000 from undergrad and then $45,000 from graduate school.
I think I had about $20,000 of debt from grad school and then also from my undergrad years, but more from my grad school years.
Yeah.
But when we went to college, it was $700 a quarter in 1999 for our tuition, $2,100 a year.
Yeah, so it was pretty manageable for most folks, but I had zero money. But anyways, the point being, it's something that's shared. We
just going to college.
Most of us of our generation and those younger than us have.
It's even more heinous now. It's absolutely fucking absurd. We're talking 70, 80, 120,000, 150,000.
Yeah, $1.7 trillion now in student debt. This is the thing. Debt is a defining feature of the world. It is sort of a design feature of how this neoliberal capitalist hellscape functions. And this is an important book because in understanding how this works, how this impacts us individually, how this connects to global problems, and how also there's a potential for this to be utilized as a form of building solidarity and collective agency and resistance, and as a potential leverage to get us out of this.
And collectively, conclusively, liberation.
Yes. Yeah. We'll get to these points because this is something we've been talking about for the last couple of months when it's come to the problem of building solidarity, collective agency for all this movement work. We've talked about this numerous times about debt being a potential thread to tie us together in solidarity for these efforts. But the first thing is recognizing, and they do a good job of this, recognizing the history of debt. As Astra Taylor has said in some of the conversations about this over the last couple of months, that debt is an ancient, violent form of economic control that predates capitalism.
Absolutely. It can be traced back to older societies where you had debt jubilee because its violence was so out of control that it threatened the dominant status quo hierarchies of civilization. And slavery, when there has been slave revolts, and the only successful slave revolt in our hemisphere at the time was the Haitian Revolution, and they had to pay for not being property anymore.
Yeah. Debt works so well along with capitalism and has been morphed into even more violent forms in the last 4 decades under this neoliberal project as a weapon of social control.
And a deeply hypocritical one, right?
Yeah. This is the thing that's so insidious. And in the opening of David Graeber's book, Debt, The First 5,000 Years, which we've mentioned numerous times, and eventually we'll get to do a conversation just dedicated to deep dive into that book. But the first thing he's saying are about how insidious this idea of debt is, because the idea that one has to repay one's debts is not an economic statement, but a moral statement. That debt isn't so much about necessarily a specific economic relation, but a relation of assumed moral responsibility.
And it starts off the book with this kind of anecdote with someone he talks to who works for like a nonprofit, and it's kind of liberal environment gala. And she's like, well, yeah, shouldn't you pay your debt? Don't you owe people? And it's like, well, no, it's actually much more ambivalent and ambiguous than we think. And it's laden with a lot of toxic hypocrisies. Like, Thomas Jefferson died and his slaves had to be sold because he couldn't manage his own debt. He was horrible at money, but he was more than happy to strategically use debt and deploy it against Native Americans to sell their territory in 1803. So he even wrote about it. Hey, we'll just, a way that we can open and expand the first formations of manifest destiny is we can use debt as a way to manage and create systems of hierarchy, and then used violence and dispossession as those means.
Yeah, really, debt is wielded as an institutional method of gaslighting.
Yep.
Like it's your problem, it's your fault for not repaying
Something's
your debts.
wrong with you. Yeah, mentally something's wrong with
you.
you. You can't control yourself, so you have a psychosis.
Yeah, it's no wonder it's become such a core feature of the neoliberal project in the last 4 decades, because this is a direct correlate, a direct mirror to the very principles of the neoliberal project.
Mm-hmm.
That government is the problem. Thank you very much, Ronald fucking Reagan.
Motherfucker.
It's everybody for themselves.
And
Fuck
it's
you,
so
I got
insidious and layered. Even in a Twitter comment I saw last week where, this writer, amateur writer, beginning writer was talking about like, Neil Gaiman's so right. If I don't get up in the morning and write my great novel, someone else is going to publish before me because they had the grit to go out and from their worker exhaustion, pull them up themselves by their bootstraps and write that fucking short story that gets published. And thank you so much, Neil Gaiman, for telling me this, you multimillionaire.
Fucking dick. And it's still prevalent. This ideology, this
find your little entrepreneur.
Yes.
Find it. It's in your pocket.
Better make sure your kids are learning how to be good entrepreneurs.
I'm a pocket entrepreneur.
One of the things that's been in vogue in the last couple of years in higher ed and the universities has been this refrains about grit and resilience. Resilience has become this buzzword, but it's clearly tied to this philosophy that it's all your fault.
Mm-hmm.
Individualize everything. There's no such thing as community.
It's an outsourcing of the sin of the institutions. Yeah, it's an outsourcing of the sins of the institutions themselves that are creating the violence.
Right. There's no such thing as society, as Margaret Thatcher said. What the fuck?
Seems like there is now with COVID.
Debt is not a practical necessity. It is a moral calculation based on myths that enshrine hierarchy. This is part of the mechanisms of the poison pyramid. This is part of how this pyramid scheme works, is there's a myth that's created about hierarchy. Some people are more important, more worthy, more closer to God, whatever the fuck.
Well,
than other people. Therefore, we got to make social mechanisms that reinforce that.
God's winners and losers.
Winners and losers, and debt is a tool that's all about winners and losers and reinforcing that that is the dichotomy. But just thinking about it without the blinders of our conventional thought helps to reveal how absurd these relations are and how they're not about practical necessity whatsoever. Because the thing about debt is everyone already got paid. That the debtor, you as the person or as the state holding the debt, are left with a manufactured burden.
Socially constructed pyramid on top of your face.
Work, you fucking tree, work.
And that burden has all kinds of psychological effects that move around us and through us.
Whether it's your house or a car or an education or a garage full of crap, those things exist in the world.
Yep.
They've been produced, right? They exist. These objects, these possessions, these services already exist. So all along the complex production pipeline, from extraction of resources from the earth to the release to you as a finished product that you own, people already got paid. And yes, some of that is through debt leverage, but capital already extracted profit. And you're left with that burden of their profit.
Recreating profit out of thin air for something that already created profit. So it's like, we're going to actually force profit out of this thing that already generated profit. How fucking absurd is that?
Rent is a form of debt. Think about how absurd rent is, because your house, your apartment, wherever you're renting, it physically exists. And will it stop existing if you stop paying rent?
It's still going to be there. It's still going to be there. Yeah. You walk away a month later and it's still be there. It's like, it's not doing anything, but you're forcing it to do something.
What the fuck is the rent for? It just doesn't add up. And everybody'd be like, well, but what about my landlord has a mortgage, or they have they got to recoup their investment, or blah, blah, blah.
I'm renting a house now. We maybe once every 3 or 4 months, we have to have and ask for some maintenance. But all those other months, we're paying the electric bill. We're paying for, the utility bills. It's just passive income for this land baron. And that's why I use the phrase land baron rather than landlord, because it tells us how strange that relationship is.
Plus, you just keep paying rent indefinitely, forever. Yeah. Does that make sense?
And when you're working, that money's already gone. So like, even when you're working for that month, you're like, my income's actually gone. That part of the income's just gone. So you don't even think you have it in the first place.
Yeah. There was a cost of producing the thing. So you're like, okay, whatever. Well, how much is it going to take to cover that cost of producing that thing? The amount of fucking rent we pay, we cover that.
Yeah.
This is only a few months of the rates of rent that we pay would have covered the initial costs. So it's almost all profit. It just does not add up. But also the real costs of producing the thing, of extracting the material from the earth and the labor to design the thing and put the thing together, to build the house, to build the apartment, has already happened. You're there in it. But baked into this artificial cost is profit. This gets back to the point we've made a number of times, that real cost is in the time and energy of us as humans working together, our time and our energy, plus the resources from the earth. That is the real cost. How much time, how much energy, and how many resources from the earth does it take to make something? That's the real cost.
A podcast episode in waiting, I'm certain. But time plus energy plus resources is the actual real cost.
Yeah.
And if you're going to make it an economy, you're going to want to think in those lines.
Yes. So the point is, rent is completely unnecessary. And we think of it as this part of nature, that rent or mortgage, paying for housing is just inevitable, that there's no other option.
It's been naturalized as almost an evolutionary product of human society. So it's almost like a DNA thing, like the way that capitalism naturalizes a rentier system. And remember, do other animals pay rent to live? We're the only animal being asked to pay rent to live. Work, fucking tree.
Your tree's going to pay rent to you.
Yeah.
It's completely unnecessary. It is not a law of the universe. It is not like gravity. It is a design choice. And it is unjust design. It is an unjust choice.
As such, it's a politics of imbalance. It's a derangement of the egalitarian values we should be creating for our world.
No wonder we're under threat of extinction when these are the arrangements that we've made. This is just bad fucking design. One of the lines they use in the book, it's good, is never forget your debt is someone else's asset.
Great line from the book.
One of the ways I see debt as a defining feature of my life, and really it's a defining feature of all of our lives that are not wealthy, aren't land barons ourselves, is that because of this debt, our lives are being stolen.
Mm-hmm.
Debt is someone stealing your life.
Profit is theft. To borrow Peter Kropotkin's and Joseph Pierre Proudhon's scream from the past, it is the actual theft, not your fucking taxes are theft. The very profit that is taken from workers' surplus labor, stolen and given to the mouths of the overfed.
Rent is the biggest line item in our so-called cost of living.
Historically used to be 15, 20%. Even in the 60s, the cost of living, the motherfucking cost of living, was much smaller for rent than it is now.
Yeah. But that there is a cost of living is a choice. We made, not you and I, but humanity made, is a thing to make up, that there's a cost of living. And it was a bad fucking choice. We must choose to abolish it. Abolish the motherfucking cost of living.
Hell yeah.
It's an awful fucking idea.
We're going to make a children's book with Samuel Jackson, and the book is called Abolish the Motherfucking Cost of Living.
Samuel Jackson.
I'm sure they'll be really interested in reading that book.
Oh, yeah. Debt is a blatant and pervasive form of social control. And if you're not already on this level of radical, meaning clear thinking, then it may seem like an absurd kind of claim. But just think about it, that if you pay rent, you pay a mortgage, you're paying a car payment, you're paying student loans, you're paying credit card bills. If you have a bullshit job.
Very few people can opt out of that arrangement. Even if you're middle class or upperly middle class, you already have debt as part of the requirement to live in this hyper-capitalist society.
If you're working to pay the bills, that is social control. Mm-hmm. This is the logic of neoliberalism. Just shut up, be grateful for what you have, be resilient, fucking work, fucking tree.
Yeah.
But that we don't talk about these things, that debt is always a private matter. Part of this whole process is like, let's bring it out into the open. Let's talk about it.
Taking the private pain and making it public. And that's the basis for real liberation and solidarity, is that we take the private pain that is turned inward like a dagger to our chest and aim it outward back at the enemy that's creating this design.
Instead of a source of shame for us individually, it should be a source of
blame.
It should be a source of blame
to the ruling 1% that dominate every aspect of our social lives.
Yeah.
And that 1% gets wealthier at the more that wealth is extracted from the private lives, as well as our common good social welfare state that we used to have. And the book quite cleverly uses the phrase, we have a debt-fair state. We don't have a welfare state.
We moved from a quote-unquote welfare state to a debt-fair state.
Starting in the 70s and starting with neoliberalism. And so the blame has to be pushed outward. It's no longer private shame.
Thinking about this too should help to highlight the derangement of the common and frequently used adages that are just parts of our everyday language that we accept without batting an eyelash, like that there's a cost of living, or that you're working to pay the bills, or that you're working to put a roof over your head, or that you're working to put food on the table, or that you're working to make a living. What the fuck? All of those are fucking stupid.
The frequency of these terms have probably increased over the 1970s, the 1980s, the 1990s. And it's a degree at which the power of these myths, these toxic myths about what you're owed and who owes you, is that it legitimizes this worldview as we use this in everyday conversation. Yeah. It becomes a framework for what is an acceptable source of self-blame.
Well, I blame Milton Friedman's pencil.
Rainbows! My pencil.
So Milton Friedman's pencil, this connects to this thing about the tree too, I should note.
Explains everything about my life and its needs. You have a pencil.
Milton Friedman's pencil.
It's the mythos. It's the fable and the poetry.
The fable and the poetry. So Milton Friedman and the co-captain of the end of the world, the poison pyramid, incarnate Ronald fucking Reagan. So they talk about this is a major turning point where, as the newly elected governor of California, just a month into his term in 1967, he, at the advice of economists laying the foundation of this neoliberal project, pushed back against the rising tide of radicalism on campuses at the then still largely tuition-free University of California.
And largely white.
Campuses, and largely white. But nonetheless, it's largely tuition-free, and saying that there are certain intellectual luxuries that perhaps we could do without. I want those intellectual luxuries back, goddammit.
And who's the we, for God's sake, right?
Well, imposing this austerity mindset, really laying the foundation in a real way that turned the tide that brought us to this moment. And he said that taxpayers shouldn't be, quote unquote, subsidizing intellectual curiosity.
And that's part of the pivot from the university as a place of spiritual and intellectual discovery and questioning.
Yeah.
Remember, the Black Panthers started out as a reading group
Yeah.
at UC Berkeley. And that radical formation was something that people were worried about. Conservative scholars like James Buchanan talked about that it was a big danger because these campuses were getting wild and they wanted free speech rights. And so this is part of the pivot to kind of workerist ideology that the university was just kind of this assembly mill for constructing the 20th century worker.
The plan was, well, we can put an end to that by charging them tuition.
Well, and the UC system used the phrase, they called it fees, because you actually paid a registration fee. And I had a professor at Western Washington University who said they paid like $25 when they attended UCLA.
Yeah.
And it was just a registration fee, and they've switched that to tuition.
Yeah. So
that was part of that turn, is you change the language to create the new basis for reality.
This story about Reagan and his pushback against the quote-unquote intellectual luxuries enjoyed by the youth in the late 60s was part of this move towards financialization, but also locates the UC campus as a location where this pivot was happening. And just to relate that to our personal experiences, I spent the last 12 years working at UCLA. One of the writers of the Debt Collective book, Hannah Appel, teaches anthropology at UCLA, and you work at another UC campus.
I work at UC Riverside. Yeah, it's a lecture and university writing program.
Big part of our lives. And I just wanted to relate this to one of the things that was always part of my thinking. Since I started working there in 2008, even though I didn't get paid enough so that I could pay my student loans.
Yeah, living in LA.
Even though I had a rent-controlled apartment, I got paid so little that I went further into debt by working there full-time. Nonetheless, the point I wanted to get to was that thinking of UC, and specifically UCLA, because it's
receives more applications than any university in the United States.
Yeah.
So it's a prima donna.
Because it's such a high-profile public university. So in terms of public universities in the world,
one of the most glamorous.
That's at the top of the list, is thinking about the potential as a public university, quote unquote, in Los Angeles as one of the premier public universities in the world, that if change could start somewhere, this would be a great place for it. That if the influencer class, the managerial class, the administrators, all the people holding power at that institution could make a change, it could be a spark.
Yeah.
That was part of my optimistic hope always in terms of the turn towards socialism that we need to make. Libraries, postal services, universities. What sort of proto-socialist institutions do we have? And what might be the one most capable of tying socialist sentiment together and pushing us towards a different way to live? Let's say the university, right?
Oh, it is.
And
the crisis is it's also one of the biggest debt creators in the country.
Right.
And so it's the birthplace of utopia, and the utopian impulse has been subverted by its ability to just manufacture debt every year for students.
Thanks, Ronald Reagan. Fuck off.
Fuck you, Ronald.
Fuck you, Ronald Reagan. So anyways, that signaling, one, the end of the university, the start of a new era of increasing debt for having the gall to try to get an education.
This new solidarity formation around the anti-tax revolts. So 67's the first kind of cri de coeur, and then the Proposition 13, 1978, the kind of anti-tax revolts. And so that's the formation that we're in, and we're stuck in it still.
Hey, lobsters, remember, government is the problem. Check out Milton Friedman's fucking pencil. Isn't it awesome?
Capitalism and freedom, baby.
There really is no alternative.
Our two parents of this misery.
Our two parents of this misery are Thatcher and Reagan, and Milton Friedman was the doctor who delivered that baby.
It's a cyborg baby. It's clearly not anyway interested in reciprocity. It's basically the Terminator microengineered.
One of the other important things that they spend time on is talking about financialization and squeezing profit out of thin air. The more pipes we can move assets through, the more we can squeeze profit out of it. And that is a defining approach of the pyramid scheme project of neoliberalism. And then the other thing was the interconnectedness of debt. This social control that we're under as individuals through the mechanisms of debt is a phenomenon that we share across the globe as millions of individuals, but also that connects the lead poison water crisis in Flint and water shutoffs during the COVID crisis in Detroit and debt peonage for Haiti and in Puerto Rico and the altogether life or debt conditions of the quote unquote global South.
That change
there's
in
this
debt.
Broad, deep, worldwide web of interconnectedness through debt.
It's basically a relationship between daddy capital and the stupid stepson, right? And that the global South is treated as a stupid stepson, and the misbehaving miscreants of Flint, Michigan, or San Bernardino, California, or Detroit that have all experienced bankruptcy or shutoffs are perpetually caught in this revolving debt trap.
So again, we have $1.7 trillion in the US of student loan debt currently. Fucking ridiculous. And that really is up to the Department of Education. They could wipe that out. It's just a choice.
93% of all loans are in fact federal loans.
And then earlier this year, we passed $14 trillion in U.S. household debt. So mortgages, student loans, credit cards, car payments, household debt, $14 trillion. Global household debt is at $48 trillion or so. And total global debt, so households plus states and countries, is $255 trillion.
And it's one thing I would have liked to have seen really dealt with in the book, where I think David Graeber does quite well with this, is this notion of debt on a global level, who owns it, and how important is it to worry about?
It reminds me of this quote from David Graeber in a talk that he gave at the end of December of last year on economics, proposing that we should just get rid of this entire discipline, economics, and take the ideas of production and consumption, throw those out, and substitute them for the idea of care and freedom.
And it's important to note that he's saying this from a place of deeper awareness than people grant him for, because he was working at the London School of Economics right up until his death. And so he was really, really feeling that there's a fraudulency with the way in which economics was arranged currently. And that the movement to care and freedom was what he often said about Occupy. Occupy was the revolt of the caring class. And it was people that actually wanted to show up the most were the people that couldn't, because they're too busy maintaining society, like hospice workers, nurses, and teachers. And they couldn't show up to these GAs because they were doing the work of care and freedom. And Graeber says that a child's joy is centered on the fact that there's a care of them by parents, and this care allows for the freedom to exist.
And the Debt Collective, as a group of activists organizing, was born out of Occupy. They tell some of this story throughout the book, and Astra does a bit of this in the foreword to the book, that before it became organized as the Debt Collective, they were part of, in April of 2012, the Occupy Student Debt Campaign, which is a protest that marked the point that we passed the 1 trillion, or 1T day, as they called it, the $1 trillion in student debt. And then a group of collaborators worked on a document, the Debt Resisters Operation Manual. Then they organized a rolling jubilee. So this was very interesting. They talk about it in a lot of their book talks and stuff.
I didn't know about it either.
They acted as debt collectors. So formed an organization where debt collectors buy up debt for pennies on the dollar. So the same way that debt collectors buy up debt for pennies on the dollar, they organized to do that. And then instead of hounding people for it, they just erased it. So they erased more than $30 million in debt from thousands of people.
This is the thing that people forget, is Occupy didn't stop occupying. It moved to occupying this debt and removing it from people's lives.
It's important to recognize that Debt Collective, along with many other things continuing to push towards emancipation, can be identified as the success of Occupy. We largely look at, in the popular sense anyways, look at Occupy as a failure of the left. But like your engagement in radical politics over the last nearly a decade, is largely sparked from relationships built at Occupy. And that's the same with the Debt Collective.
And let's be honest, did Martin Luther King achieve his dreams? By the standpoint of left politics and resistance, anti-authoritarian movements, most of them do fail. They don't reach the shores. But that doesn't mean we're not having bigger and bigger spectacular failures. The failures are getting more interesting.
Yeah.
And it creates new organizers.
Yeah.
So Astra Taylor is not who she would be without Occupy.
Yeah.
David Graeber wouldn't be who he was without Occupy. And so these people, especially Thomas Goki, who talks about this book in This Is Hell, their identities are forged from Occupy. It has a way of creating new movements, new organizers.
So then in 2014, they formed the Debt Collective, a union for debtors. And that is the sort of core notion behind the Debt Collective is, and in some of the podcasts about this, I think Astra was talking about this, that Thomas Goki had said at one point, why don't we form unions for debtors the way that there's labor unions?
It's an innovation
sort
of
of
social
the
relation.
idea.
You know, in LA, there's a famous organization, which I think is one of the most successful historically in LA, is the Bus Riders Union. And so these unions are about shared suffering. And it doesn't have to be just worker suffering or rent and tenants unions. You can do this around debt as well.
That's the whole core of Debt Collective as an organization is a union for debtors.
Yeah.
Unionizing folks who have debt, which is so much of us. And this is why it's such an interesting, potentially
liberatory solution,
right?
Yeah.
Yeah, is debt unionization.
It's a core innovation of the group, definitely.
They apparently just recently started to implement a dues paying system. So this is moving away from
sin checks from the wealthy, where you're getting nonprofit money from the people that actually cause the fucking problems. Like, you don't want to pay for this from Bank of America.
No. And, Astra did get a fellowship from the Shuttleworth Foundation in 2015. And over the past 5 years, they've provided over $1 million in funding to the Debt Collective. But as a dues paying union, hopefully moving towards what you've talked about and what you've suggested in many of our conversations.
Sunrise Movement,
What Sunrise Move and others need to do is be self-funded, funded by members.
This is the call of the left in general.
Yes.
Is a change in behavior from moving away from this internet freemium bullshit to actually paying for a socialist utopia. It requires actually paying for our own institutions and protecting them.
Fuck Patreon, join a union.
Yeah.
And what's really kind of awesome is that Debt Collective getting right at the core of what's a problem tying all of us together, right? And helping to do away with these myths, but also having some really significant wins. Just in the 5 years of work, making some significant strides. And one of the things really impressive is they're organizing around a student debt strike, where they started with 15 people, then grew to thousands of people around the Corinthian predatory for-profit college.
Which is really targeted kind of like fast food around folks of color, poor people, single mothers. This college, like a lot of for-profit colleges, are going to the most anxious and desperate part of the human population that wants to protect and take care of their family and basically barrel drive them with debt. And they did the work of actually looking at the laws, and there's something called the defense of repayment that works with for-profit colleges, that if these for-profit colleges break the law, you can refuse to pay them back. And Betsy DeVos, the Trump administration, basically had to remove all this debt because there was actually written in the law. And that was something Debt Collective was actually able to find that lawyers didn't pay attention to. Because in general, the poor of the poor and the folks of color are ignored when it comes to litigation.
Defense to repayment is what it's called. And the Debt Collective helped to abolish more than $1 billion of student debt through this existing legal mechanism. So that's a big win. And part of what pushed public sentiment and newly elected members of Congress in the midterm elections to recognize and put forward the College for All bill the summer of last year.
It wasn't just Bernie Sanders who asked for the removal of all debt. It was one of Elizabeth Warren's own consultants and writers of her policy. They cited the Debt Collective for the idea of removal of debt. Now, it doesn't go nearly as far, I think, but that was that the Debt Collective was able to have this kind of impact because it's not just for the College for All, it's also the removal of debt. Bernie Sanders wasn't even talking about the cancellation of debt in 2016. So we're seeing the power of this organization.
The other thing that they helped to uncover was this little known part of the existing federal law. It's called compromise and settlement, which gives the Department of Education the authority to erase all student debt. Virtually in an instant, just virtually it's keystroke. If they just choose to, President and the Department of Education decide to, they can just erase federal student debt. and recognizing this part of what has pushed what's happened recently. About a month ago, Elizabeth Warren and Chuck Schumer, surprisingly, came together to introduce a bill to push to ask the next president to cancel $50,000 in student debt per borrower.
That mirrors what was in Warren's policy platform when she was running for her failed presidential bid. Biden right now is only saying that he'll eliminate 10,000. So that's pushing from the left and shows a potential to try to get out voters by actually speaking to their actual needs. And it's not just the students. It would be the greatest stimulus project to cancel all student debt in U.S. history. We already know that. The studies are in. It would be a huge removal of pressure and a huge source of economic growth.
Easy, no-brainer, press delete on all $1.7 trillion of that debt.
Digits on a fucking screen. It's a hallucination. Punch it out.
Make college free for everybody. Decommodify education.
Abso-fucking-lutely.
Organizing around debt and seeing debt as a location for unionization, for building solidarity and building collective agency and political power, building broad-based, multiracial, multi-class political power. There's great potential here. And I think one of the things to draw attention to is how this relates to one of the other texts we spent quite a bit of time the last few months talking about, which was Eric Olin Wright's posthumously published book, How to Be an Anti-Capitalist in the 21st Century. We did an episode dedicated to that, episode 26. I've been talking about that, working that in ever since. That what he left with at the end of the book was thinking about the problem of collective agency and building solidarity. He talked about eroding capitalism and combining strategic logics of existing anti-capitalist struggle into a project of eroding capitalism. But ultimately, how are we going to do those things unless we can build collective agency and the political power to make some of these obvious changes like pressing delete on student debt?
And UBI and these sorts of things, both escaping and taming and resisting capitalism. These are these strategic logics that he talks about in the book. And I think what the Debt Collective as a book does is it gives us a good starting point to actually initiate these strategic logics. If we start from the Debt Collective and the aims of it, we can then start putting out these logics into a pattern.
We've talked about how debt should and could be potentially a way to do this. That what Eric Olin Wright didn't identify was debt, this project specifically, as the Debt Collective is undertaking, as really the best potential for building that broad-based solidarity.
Global, national, and local solidarity, because we have basically, 13% unionization rates, so something like 3 or 6% private unionization rates versus 30% for public unions in the U.S. But the debt is actually the kind of formation that could create a new union movement because it's so universal.
And this is awesome. This is what Debt Collective is doing. Like, this is
because 80% of the population only owes 7% of the wealth. So that tells you they're deep in the hole. That 80% of the population only has 7% of all U.S. wealth means that people are already not just at zero, they're in the negatives. And that is the tapestry for this larger solidarity network that can form the most important union in the U.S. history right now.
I have negative digits on my screen. Who else does? Let's band together.
Put the hands up and make it public, right? Let's start making debt public.
Maybe that annoying EDM Coachella call of put your motherfucking hands up. This is actually where we be useful. Put your hands up. Are you in debt? Do you have a negative wealth?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's something we have to think about is this was the kind of formation for solidarity that can be long lasting, that doesn't have to be confined to a workplace. That can become a fabric for a longer resistance movement. Because if we take on global debt, we rearrange power structures and who gets to decide how we damage the earth.
The basic premise is largely that labor unions are no longer the source of broad shared experience.
13% of the population, right?
But not only have they been attacked systematically forever, as long as capitalism's been around, it's been antagonistic to unionizing, obviously. And not only have they been decimated, they no longer have the potential of broad shared experience that could unite a broad
There's no
movement.
culture. There's no union halls. Where are the union halls? They don't exist. So it's not even the cultural rituals of this. So this formation becomes powerful when you think about debt, because people can tell very personal traumatic stories that that deepen. Remember, the personal is political. This is what we learned from the feminist movement, that when we start engaging in personal storytelling and we all have personal stories of debt, then it becomes very easy to build this larger movement.
And this is one of the things they're doing really well here in their work, both in the book and beyond it, is tying the personal to the political in their slogans that they're using and in the writing in the book. Individually, our debts overwhelm us, but together they make us powerful.
Yeah, absolutely. We have to start telling those stories even in our own documents.
One of the things highlighting this that they write in the book is indebtedness is a lived experience upon which solidarity can be built. And it is also a hidden geography of potential global people power. Our debt is a non-violent weapon we all have access to if we can leverage it in concert. This is the thing. It is a myth. It is a construct that is stealing all of our lives. And if we unite around this, we can turn that around so that it can be a tool, a weapon to fight for emancipation.
And it can be scalable because we can start on the local individual level. We can also look at cities that work together in unison to demand better bond repayment systems, or nation states in the global south, or Italy and Greece. They can unite to do these kinds of debt strikes. And it creates all these manifest possibilities from the individual to an ecology that goes much higher. And that's what I think is really innovative about the book, is saying it's not just unions for individuals, it's unions for cities and states and for nation states to actually create these larger structures of resistance.
I'm glad to see that their whole project are making this clear, that inspired by and drawing from the wisdom of Critical Resistance, the grassroots prison abolition organization that Angela Davis and Ruth Wilson Gilmore and others have been involved with and founded, that the objective is not forgiveness. We don't even put this in the terms of debt forgiveness or cancellation. It's debt abolition. And adopting an actual abolitionist stance, positioning this as an abolitionist project.
And that term and idea comes from the Critical Resistance group that deals with incarceration and the carceral state, Dylan Rodriguez at UC Riverside as well. And that this idea of debt abolition is that it's the abolition of the concept of debt, that a new society that's formed has to relinquish this idea of debt as a normal or natural phenomenon, especially when it's no longer created by consensus.
Yeah, and they say that abolition is not only about dismantling oppressive structures or for a world without. Abolition is a strategy and vision for a world with social housing, healthcare, education, art, and meaningful work, and a life free from state violence and material want. Debt abolition works similarly. It is a vision for a world without exploitive debt contracts and with socially financed healthcare, education, housing, and more.
Fuck yes.
Fuck yeah.
I'm singing my song.
That gets right to the idea shape of the golden square we talk about all the time. This is the potential power of debt strikes and organizing around debt as leverage, is all these different types of debt become potential leverage points to win the actual material provisions and the actual material rights that we all deserve, and for decommodifying public goods. So imagine rent strikes to win community land trusts, to take that out of private ownership and private property relations and put them into the trust of the community.
And kids striking in middle school over their food debt, right? So we talk about food, shelter, healthcare debt, right? Education debt. Oh my God, every aspect of the golden square is in debt to people. And so this is the kind of claim that we would like to make, is that if this book started from the golden square, this would be a warp drive system. We would actually be able to really get farther and faster if the beginning parts of this engine started from a human rights framework of the golden square, the rights to food, shelter, healthcare, and education as an inalienable rights, non-negotiable, out the door, motherfucking human rights. And then you build from that to look at how unjust these debt systems are, because they're piranhas, they're vampire squids that are attacking the rights that we should be starting with for a dignified society.
Throughout the book and the whole framing, the whole project is really right up against this idea of the golden square, that these things that are our material needs should be public goods. They should be provisions. They should be decommodified. They talk about that and name some parts of the golden square again and again and make those assertions that are right in line with what we've been talking about. But in one particular paragraph in the book,
kind of like our situation with Planet to Win, right? There's this one moment where it reveals something pretty powerful. And we had that with the conversation about Virginia Woolf. So this one is another kind of paragraph.
Right. Like just in the right direction, like shot an arrow, but just like, just
part of it split off. Yeah, part of it split off.
In the direction, I think what we will humbly offer is perhaps a way to square this circle, as it were, on this problem.
Yes.
Because they skirt the phrase human rights, which is a little bit surprising because of how much folks like Bernie Sanders have in his campaigns.
Was so great at framing it as rights.
Yeah.
And the kind of Jacobin set, Marxist set is wanting to problematize human rights as an entirely neoliberal construct, which is bullshit.
Yeah.
Because human rights were just co-opted by the right. Like any other good left idea, it gets co-opted by the right. And we should embrace, like the word freedom, like in the book Inventing the Future, we should embrace human rights discourse.
There's actually two paragraphs that were back to back here that one, they're like almost exactly saying the golden square, and then in the next calling into question some of the language there. So I just want to read these two and then we'll talk about it. So we deserve a society that sees healthcare not just as a human right, but as a public good, inseparable from the broader ecology. A society that understands public health must account for the air we breathe, the water we drink, the food we eat, and the land that gives us life. We deserve access to education that is not just career training, but also an expansive and lifelong process of encouraging curiosity and fostering informed, critical, and creative thinking. We deserve housing that is publicly funded as a community resource, not as a speculative asset or a private commodity. We must work to create a society that can plan ahead and sustain itself over the long term, without burning through its resources so a few can profit here and now. In the next paragraph, the distinction between a human right and a public good is crucial. It's the difference between a theoretical entitlement and a concrete good or service that you actually receive. Building on the work of anthropologist James Ferguson, we have to shift our vision from a quote-unquote right to something, like a right to housing, to education, to health, to a material share of that thing, a house, an education, healthcare. To move from human rights to material shares is to move from abstract equalities, rarely realized in practice, to the distribution of real goods to those who are their rightful owners.
So the problem right there is rarely realized in practice.
Yes.
Well, the problem with that is there's no shared agreement that these are human rights. Right? It can't be realized when there's no moral compass that's been laid out and been drummed into the psyche of the global population that these are fundamental core rights, non-negotiable. So this idea of rarely realized, there's no consensus among the ruling class that these are even rights. Otherwise, they wouldn't operate in this for-profit model. So that's a problem I have immediately with that kind of thing is, well, number one, we haven't created these as the new truths of the world.
Right. What they reference here is work of James Ferguson. I think specifically is drawn from a book that he wrote called Give a Man a Fish, Reflections on the New Politics of Distribution. He talks about moving to the idea of rightful shares of things, quote unquote, rightful shares is his term. And there's a thing we'll leave a link to that is a recent conversation or lecture, I guess, from Jacobin this summer, Samuel Moyne, who wrote a book about this problem, or a lecture called The Problem with Human Rights, addressing why would anybody be avoiding this phrase, human rights? Well, it's because, exactly like you pointed out, this last sentence of this paragraph, abstract equalities rarely realized in practice. So this point about concrete good or service that you actually receive is abso-fucking-lutely what we mean when we say the food, shelter, healthcare, and education must be decommodified, must be provided to everyone, must be essential human rights.
It's a fabrication and false division, right? It's a fabrication and false division of the rights-based framework. The rights-based framework is that it's automatically included. It doesn't matter where the public provision exists. It might come from the state, local actors, it might come from national actors, but it's just a right. It's not some abstract thing.
But this is the problem, as it were, with the phrase human rights, as these aforementioned folks have spent a lot of time detailing is that over the last 40 years, as part of the neoliberal project specifically, there has been the co-opting of the term human rights, largely in the imagination of the US and the US public, fostering the idea that quote unquote human rights are things that are only about violence against people outside of the US.
Mm-hmm.
And that human rights never refer to things inside the U.S.
It's
that
a quoting
the U.S.
scheme.
The U.S. may take up issues of civil rights from time to time, but there's the idea that human rights were achieved long ago, which is totally fucking false, especially if we just look at the United Nations Declaration on Human Rights from the 40s, that the Golden Square is almost outlined there, but it's never...
doesn't apply here. And I think the history of that is probably because of the tragedy of the civil rights movement. The pivot that MLK was moving from civil rights to human rights and actual power redistribution ended with his assassination. So we had a partial pivot with the civil rights movement, thinking of a kind of a new deal, a new deal, right?
Yeah.
The formation of policies about a higher minimum wage, a Jobs Guarantee Act, those sorts of things. And this is a famous quote from Martin Luther King, is that what's the point of getting a place at the lunch table if you can't afford the hamburger? And that in a private meeting with agitators, activists, and civic figures, that he was going to move into a new terrain that was going to make him unpopular, right? Because he was actually looking at motherfucking redistribution.
Yeah.
This country will do anything but redistribution. White people will go into the suburbs because they want to avoid redistribution, right?
I totally acknowledge that the term human rights obviously has been hollowed out,
co-opted,
and our common sense, our shared common sense, doesn't acknowledge human rights in the emancipatory way that it ought to have been, that it, especially in our lifetimes, human rights does not really mean what it should. Especially this Jacobin discussion, spend a lot of time
fidgeting and problematizing it. But the problem is, it's not acknowledging that the success of Bernie Sanders' campaign was the mantra, the anaphora of a human rights claim. Healthcare is a human right. Education is a human right. These things were said again and again at his rallies. And they got the largest applause because they spoke to a spiritual animus of a collective good. And I think the problem of the left is you let the right take your frameworks. Freedom's our party.
I think as a radical socialist left, as a broad movement fighting for emancipation, for an egalitarian world, that we have to hold the line on human rights.
Yes. We don't give up the rope.
I mean, look, insofar as it's a purely semantic and or strategic debate about the effectiveness at a certain place in time, in context, about a phrase because of the way that it's been co-opted, and therefore you make a calculation to use different phrases, all fair game. But beyond that, that we are human beings and that we should have guaranteed to us certain level of dignity, we cannot give that up. So whether or not that means that a common use of the phrase human rights or some other formation of language, some other phraseology, agnostic on that point. But we have to hold the line.
But we're never going to get consensus if we don't start from a human rights framework. Everything we want to win starts from a human rights framework, and that we build the consensus toward that as an idea. Now, we can show how we can approximate those public provisions, and that can buttress the claim for human rights by showing that it is possible that we can create an economy using MMT and Green New Deal to actually create those provisions, but you cannot let go of the rope. And letting go of the rope is letting go of these human rights. We should not let the right control the framework.
We can't let a just and moral framework be tossed aside just because neoliberal capitalist con artists co-opted it.
Peed in the ocean. Peed in the ocean. We're not going to give up the ocean just because somebody peed in it.
When we use this phrase when talking about the Golden Square, food, shelter, healthcare, and education, the basic necessities for a dignified life, we absolutely mean by that phrase, human rights, that these must be fully decommodified provisions. That means they are free. So when we say food, shelter, healthcare, and education, we mean fully decommodified goods and services. We mean free food for all, free shelter for all, free healthcare for all, and free education for all. And I think that's entirely in line with what the Debt Collective is aiming for. So I think we are in accord there.
We're 90% there.
What we would humbly offer is this idea shape. Again, it's not a thing that anybody needs any intellectual property rights to.
It's already in the air.
It is just part of the air. It is just identifying
And they mentioned
the truth.
3 of those many times in the book. The foreword by Astor Taylor, the first chapter and second chapter, it mentions education, healthcare, and shelter again and again. So it's there. They're saying it. We're just saying that it has to be the starting point.
this idea shape of the golden square is a way to cut through the bullshit. This is as poetically condensed and morally and materially to the point as we can make it, to make it an undeniable assertion of a simple moral truth that we have a shared responsibility to provide each other with the material means to live a dignified life, that should be our new social contract.
That speaks to the golden rule, and this is a concrete extension of the golden rule. If you say, well, how could it be a right? Well, do you want your daughter to have food, shelter, healthcare, and education? Then who the fuck are you to say other people don't deserve that?
Yeah.
And that's the frame of reciprocity.
Yeah.
It speaks to a higher value system that inspires people and creates a web of connectedness.
The art to this is really just in having an anarchist ethic as the thing that you start from, that I don't deserve more than anyone else, and no one else should have dominion over me, that we are all equal participants and all should share in the bounty of this fragile planet. And from there, that helps to determine a sense of clarity. And the golden square as a proposition is really just about providing clarity so that we can get there quicker. Yes, it means a lot of other things. The world is complex, and it's not just these four things. And again, we use these terms in an expansive way. Again, shelter doesn't mean just a house, everything that shelters us. It's the means to sustain, the means to protect, the means to heal, and the means to grow. But we just use those words to get right to the point.
It's just a constellation in the night sky that we can see wherever we are. It's universal. It reminds us that we are in the moment on this world, and we can clearly see where we want to navigate to.
Anarchy is the North Star of human decency. So we're using that North Star to guide our thinking about the real practical necessities for freedom. In a radically egalitarian project, we got to cut out the fucking bullshit.
And we can explain our socialism better. As an idea, when we say, well, what do you mean by socialism? Well, I mean the full decommodification of food, shelter, healthcare, and education. That's the golden square. That's what socialism means to me.
I personally want to remain as open and elastic as possible to evolving my thinking and to adapting to the conversation and moving along together in a cooperative way. So if we need to alter our thinking about these things, then we need to alter our thinking about these things. So I think we're spending a lot of focus on this one paragraph and this one point, but part of it is because I think it threw me for a kind of like, well, do I need to reconsider the way I've been talking about this?
But it's something we've said with many of these books that we've talked about for our podcast, that if this was part of the engine, we would have our warp drive going.
It made me think, should the golden square be framed in terms of quote unquote human rights, or should it be framed in terms of quote unquote public goods? So I thought about that for a bit, and I think, well, why not both? Why not think about it as the human rights to material shares of public goods?
Part of the art.
This is, we talk about
cause and effect art.
I mean, this is the thing I want to try to avoid too, in an honest and earnest effort to contribute to an emancipatory project, is that we adapt and we build and we incorporate in a way that we build a motherfucking mixtape, because the future will be a motherfucking mixtape. We don't know what those tracks will be, but hopefully we just
in
choose
the final
tracks.
run, but we have ideas of certain songs.
What is important about this problem, as it were, about the notion of human rights and how it relates to our assertion of the golden square, that these things that are necessities for a dignified life must be human rights, is that this is in contrast to where we typically see a lot of these things framed in terms of access, opportunity, or affordability, and those being the horizon lines, and often not even a clarity about where that horizon line is. But this is the other part of the golden square, is that it's clear as possible about this sensible, bare minimum, let's be dignified to each other on this shared planet kind of horizon of socialism. It's not about just access, opportunity, or affordability, but full and generous provision of real material outcome.
The limits would be within an ecologically sustainable model, right? That's the actual minimum, is the equilibrium that we have to create on the planet.
So this point of the difference between a theoretical entitlement and a concrete good or service that you actually receive, the thing that James Ferguson talks about of rightful shares, is you don't just want the right to a house, you want an actual house. And that's what we mean, is an actual house, an actual shelter, actual food, actual education, lifelong cradle to grave provisions as high quality as possible that we can create and provide to each other, actual provisions of these things.
Yeah, and the neoliberal framework of human rights is to point fingers. It doesn't actually demand or create those. It becomes a point of complaint to judge a country and deny them debt forgiveness. It's like, look at your human rights. When we talk about this human rights framework, it includes the material provisions. Everything that sustains, heals, nourishes, these things immediately imply that there's a follow-through. Otherwise, it doesn't matter that it's an abstraction.
When you recognize that this is what we're talking about, realize that this has never been achieved anywhere
on the human planet.
On Earth. Yes, I'm housed and I have access to food and I have access to healthcare. And I live in Canada right now, so I have access to a partially socialized, partially decommodified healthcare system. But there are still barriers. There's still commodities. I pay rent. What this means is no more fucking rent. It means abolishing the motherfucking cost of living.
Yeah, absolutely.
It is a socialist vision that centers the conditions of people's lives instead of the structure of the state and the economy.
Hit me.
And this is why we say it's a no bullshit
blueprint for socialism.
Because it's not about the structure of the state. It's about the conditions of lives.
Yeah. Whether that comes from a state apparatus or more locally generated through people's assemblies.
But what it implies, nonetheless, is because it is an assertion of generous public provisions, of generous public goods, it implies the purpose of any legitimate state.
The social contract.
It is a sensible social contract. It is a measuring stick to identify the legitimacy of any state.
And we see that in a recent Navarro Radio podcast episode where they actually call the Donald Trump and Biden debate the failed state debate, because it acknowledges that America is a failed state that can't bail out Americans for their basic provisions during COVID crisis. That we live in a series of many failed states because they can't even do the irreducible minimum, let alone the transitional minimum that would be the golden square.
The most urgent texts that we've been talking about have again and again drawn on this notion of a new social contract. I mean, more or less, that's what the notion of a Green New Deal is, a new deal for society, a new contract for society, a new social understanding, a new normal. And this framework that gets right to the fucking point about the material conditions in people's lives and the necessary threshold to cross for freedom needs to be at the core of a new deal, a new arrangement, a new reworking of society needs to start with this at its core. Beyond just this notion of public goods, though, they offer the idea or the notion of reparative public goods. And again, this is entirely in accord with what we've been talking about in many conversations. I'm going to read just another succinct and clear passage about this. The public goods we fight for must also repair the structural violence of racial capitalism and redress massive land dispossession from indigenous peoples. This means that a student debt strike and jubilee must aim to transform our educational system, not just make it tuition free. When we talk about free higher education, state-funded colleges and universities, we also need to talk about the so-called public land on which these universities sit, and the intergenerational wealth transfer that land represents from indigenous people to settlers. Because public land is stolen land, as indigenous activist groups such as the Red Nation remind us, then recommoning that land must be part of the process of redress. When we advocate for free higher education, we also have to talk about freedom.
Excellent.
So the way that we envision the Golden Square is also as a reparative.
Reparations, transformation, and reckoning, I think, is the way to think of that framework, is reparations, transformation, and this kind of reckoning that's needed all coupled together. So as we decommodify, we have to put more emphasis and funding in areas where the inequality already pre-exists.
We draw on the wisdom of radical Black and queer indigenous feminism, like we've talked about numerous times, Barbara Smith and the Combahee River Collective, and the assertion that until Black women, we add, and queer and indigenous folks are free. none of us will be free. And this is part of the radical Green New Deal as a proposal, is to undertake a remaking of our economy in such a way that it will put those who have been historically disadvantaged and who have been stolen from the most, put them at the fore. And this is a measure of whether or not we are making stride in an egalitarian way. We aren't going to be free until those historically disadvantaged are free.
Absolutely. And if we think about this book of the Debt Collective, right? Can't Pay, Won't Pay, this book about debt, it's part of what I think is now really a trilogy on debt, with David Graeber's 2011 publication of Debt, the First 5,000 Years. And in 2015 was Mr. Robot. And that was the first public examination of debt as a TV show. And there's a great quote that I want to elicit it before I move back to the Debt Collective. And this is Mr. Robot talking to Elliot. Is any of this real? I mean, look at this. Look at it. A world built on fantasy, synthetic emotions in the form of pills, psychological warfare in the form of advertising, mind-altering chemicals in the form of food, brainwashing seminars in the form of media, controlled, isolated bubbles in the form of social networks. Real? You want to talk about reality? We haven't even lived in anything remotely close to it since the turn of the century. We turned it off, took out the batteries, snacked on a bag of GMOs, and we tossed the remnants into an ever-expanding dumpster of the human condition. We live in branded houses, trademarked by corporations, built on bipolar numbers, jumping up and down on digital displays, hypnotizing us into the biggest slumber mankind has ever seen. You'd have to dig pretty deep, kiddo, before you can find anything really real. We live in a kingdom of bullshit that even if you've lived in it for far too long, you wouldn't recognize. So tell me about not being real. I'm no less real than the fucking beef patty in your fucking Big Mac. As far as you're concerned, Elliot, I am very real. We are all together now, whether you like it or not. And so this manifestation of Mr. Robot talking to Elliot is a manifestation of this hallucination that is debt.
Yep.
Right.
Yep.
And so from Graeber's book in 2011 was the kind of warning shot. We create a cultural engagement with debt in popular media. This book is part of the third element of that trilogy. The Debt Collectives Can't Pay, Won't Pay, where we actually, now that we've created this dominant conversation through media, we've done the intellectual work that David Graeber's done. Now we can actually take action. This is that part of the trilogy where we actually take action of this real world and we make the real world consecrated as something from us, to us, for each other.
We are all together now in debt.
Yes, exactly. And so this is, I think, part of this third component that we've been missing.
Yes.
We have the popular conception.
Yes.
We have the intellectual work done. And now they're asking for us to form debt collectives.
The texts that we celebrate the most and spend the most time engaging with in this podcast project tend to be reflective of the thesis from Inventing the Future, Nick Cernak and Alex Williams' book that we talked about in previous episodes, of creating a new hegemony, a counter hegemony or a new hegemony, of creating a quote unquote new normal, of doing the counter work to the neoliberal project, creating a new common sense, of uncovering these myths, breaking down these false barriers so that we can see clearly and rebuild the world along egalitarian lines.
And so debt, the first 5,000 years, Mr. Robot, all 4 seasons. And then finally with this book, we have the action plan laid out in its initial stages to actually create these broad-based unions between individuals, cities, and nation states.
Reparative Public Goods is positioning this struggle, as these things are all interconnected, as part of a struggle for reparations. And so when we think about this, like Graeber says, that debt is a moral claim, not an economic claim. We need to think about who is owed what. And clearly, a great debt is owed to the rest of the planet.
Climate change.
Yeah.
Climate change, right? And they talk about that at the end of the book. It's like the reparative aspects include, it's not that they owe us a debt, it's that we owe them debts that are ongoing.
One last thing I want to add in here to the conversation, since this has to do with this shared hallucination of money and breaking down these myths. They don't touch on it much in the book, but a core part of breaking down these myths is breaking down the myths about taxes. And specifically, this ties back to the Ronald Reagan 1967 assertion that taxpayers shouldn't be paying for
intellectual luxuries.
That taxpayers shouldn't be subsidizing intellectual curiosity. one of the things that's important to see clearly is the actual function of taxes in an economy. The real function of taxes is to address inequality. The real function of taxes is to address inequality.
Act as a referee.
Act as a referee. So
Over
make sure
surplus labor that's stolen from workers.
Yeah.
It's a crude mechanism to not only control inflation, which is often the claim for most economics, but also really it's a way to referee the inequalities that capitalism naturally creates.
Yeah.
There's no doubt that taxation is a way of creating some sense of fairness, however you approximate it.
So in the project of radically egalitarian, emancipatory project, we need to be clear about what taxes can help us do and how they can help create space to build more freedom, to build more equality. That in that regard, we would advocate for instance, a 100% tax rate on all income over $1 million US annually. All forms of income, inheritance, capital gains, etc. Just as an example.
We could be more radical because we're saying 1 million because of real estate issues. But if we had fully decommodified lives to food, shelter, healthcare, we could lower that much farther down.
But even in today's 2020s bullshit economic terms, $1 million, nobody fucking needs more than $1 million.
Absolutely.
I haven't earned $1 million in my whole goddamn life. I worked for 30 fucking years. There's no reason anybody needs more than $1 million in a year.
And we could call it, it's used often in conversation, the maximum wealth tax.
Yeah.
Right.
Beyond just annual accumulations of wealth, we think about lifetime accumulations. Why does anybody need, let's choose a reasonable number in that regard, more than 5 million? And if we think about the things that through debt strikes, through debt union organizing, we might win as public goods like public banks. So imagine credit card debt strike to win abolition of credit scores and the creation of public banks and postal banking. Imagine, for instance, Los Angeles. Los Angeles is a county, has a public bank, and you automatically get your universal basic income deposited into your public bank account
every month.
And anything else that you get at $1 million, it just automatically switches anything over $1 million into the public funds, into a social wealth fund.
Social garnishment.
And anything in your total savings over $5 million, it just automatically goes into social wealth fund that would fund reparative public goods.
We've got money episodes to do, goddammit.
The point is, the function of taxes is to address inequality, and we should use them for that purpose. So, excellent book. This might be one I read multiple times because I get a kick out of the sense of potential solidarity in the like-mindedness and clarity of thinking and the lack of bullshit. I think, like you said, is it's to the point, it's short, it uses accessible language, it's written by a group. This is doing the kind of important work along abolitionist trajectory that we need to be engaged in. And there's real potential here. So I think it's really exciting. And I hope that this vision of connecting and building solidarity, not just locally or nationally, but globally, can happen through some of these mechanisms.
And it's the least abstract book you could ever read on debt.
Yeah.
It's so concrete. It's so meaningfully accessible. It provides real life examples and also talks about utopian potentials of these union formations.
Yeah.
So in some sense, it feels like we're moving into the action space where now we can start to have a battle plan. This book is a battle plan for the future. And, when you have Mr. Robot, it's the popular conception. It's the creation of a cultural hegemony around the conversation of the evils of debt and how it destroys lives. We're away from the abstraction of Graeber looking at the philosophical and historical and economic trajectory of debt to actually saying, okay, what are we going to do about it?
Yeah.
So this is actually the blueprint to actually solve the debt crisis.
It rightly ought to be central to the bigger project of rebuilding the world. It is a choice that we make. We need to design a better world. Humanity is using an ancient operating system designed around fabricated hierarchies. We call this operating system the poison pyramid, and neoliberalism is the current version of this OS. But we need to switch operating systems. We need the golden square. We need socialism.
Abso-fucking-lutely. Abolish the motherfucking cost of living.
This was a longer conversation than normal, but I think it was deservedly so.
Absolutely.
And I appreciate having this chat with you.
And thanks for joining us.
Cheers.
Cheers.